Our next speaker, Rebecca Shlafer, is an assistant professor in the Division of General Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine at the University of Minnesota. She is one of the few researchers in the country whose work focuses on ways that parental incarceration impacts children. Earlier this fall, Dr. Shlafer was invited to the White House to discuss her research. And due in large part to her relationship with Sesame Workshop, we have her to thank for having copies of the newly developed toolkits about parental incarceration. Today, Dr. Shlafer will talk about her work and why this topic is so important for all of us who work on the behalf of children and families. Thank you.
Okay, mic's on. You can all hear me in the back? Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, and what a wonderful way to start off our day. It has been a kind of a wild ride in the last 6 months. As Deborah mentioned, I've had some pretty exciting things happen with regard to Sesame Street, and I'm not going to slough off a trip to the White House, but honestly, today when I walked in and I looked around and I saw colleagues and friends and folks who are all committed to this issue, I thought this is way better than being at the White House, and I mean that in all seriousness. There have been a handful of us who have been working on this issue in the state for some time now, and to see this many people in the room and to know that there are hundreds of people across our state who are focused on this issue and actually really, truly care about this issue, that makes me think that in some way part of my job is done, that there are lots of people in this audience who can carry us through and help really try to make a difference in this issue. So I was charged with setting the stage. I think anytime you have a title that says Research Perspectives on Parental Incarceration, it sounds a little boring, but I promise you we'll keep it interesting. So my polling question is, which continent has the largest prison population? Is it Asia, North and Central America, Europe, Africa, or South America? I'll give you a chance to check in. She's giving you time to cheat and look it up on your phones. All right, we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. Who thinks it's Asia? Show of hands. This is when technology fails. Anybody think it's Asia? Okay. Continent has the largest prison population. Nobody thinks it's Asia. I see some hands in the back. Thank you. B is North and Central America. Look around, folks. Look around. Okay. C is Europe. Anybody think it's Europe? D, Africa. E, South America. All right, a couple. All right, so it's actually Asia, but in fairness, so this is the largest total prison population, but of course what we know, right, which you always hear, is that per capita, the United States far and away exceeds all of those other continents. We incarcerate more per capita, per 100,000 persons in the United States than anywhere else in the world. Much, much, much higher. So if you walk away learning anything today, it's Asia. And what we know, right, as you often will hear, is that the US incarceration rate between 1925 and now has really skyrocketed. And you can see a dramatic increase around the mid-1980s, which has really resulted in what we're going to talk about today, which is the impact on the next generation. There are a lot of speculation, a lot of discussion about why we might have seen that increase, in large part due to changes in drug sentencing and offenses that got larger, longer sentences, and 3 strikes you're out rules, and all sorts of changes in policies that resulted in a growing prison population. What we know, though, is that when we look at that increase with regard to the number of adults who have been incarcerated in the United States, we can focus particularly on those adults who are also parents. What we know is that between 2007 1991 and mid-year 2007, the number of parents who were held in state and federal prisons increased by 79%. And it is estimated that 52% of state inmates and 63% of federal inmates are parents of minor children. So we can talk in numbers, or we could think about it this way. And we could expect that at least half of these men are also fathers. And I will never forget the day that I gave a similar presentation to this, and a warden came up to me afterwards and he said, "Oh, it was a great presentation, but I gotta be honest with you, I've never thought about the fact that half of the men in my facility are also fathers. Never thought about that." And what we know is these are likely underestimates, because we don't know when men come in, and we'll talk about this in Minnesota probably today, we really don't know how many men are in our system that are also fathers, or women that are also mothers. You can imagine there's a lot of resistance to wanting to disclose that information your first day in prison, right? So we could look at these men and know that half of them are fathers, or we could look at this group of women and know that nearly 2/3 of these women are mothers, a group that more than doubled between 1991 and 2007. Of course, we can also think about the impact that this has on the next generation, and we can see it this way. Based on the Bureau of Justice statistic estimates, what we know is that 1 in every 43 children has a parent in a state or federal prison currently. That's essentially 1 child in every other American classroom across this country. Of course, we know that these numbers, when we think about that 1 in 43, those numbers severely underestimate the scope of this issue, because they don't account for, the Bureau of Justice Statistics numbers don't account for the number of parents who are currently in county jails. They don't account for the number of parents who are also currently in community corrections. And so when Deborah mentioned the 2.7 million, that's probably a much better estimate when we think about the whole scope, but really still probably a very conservative estimate of the number of children who are impacted. And so you saw some of the promotional stuff come out about this when you registered for this event, thinking about the fact that parental incarceration is a bigger issue than juvenile diabetes or autism. I'm in a school of medicine, and folks all the time will kind of scratch their head and say, "You do what? You study incarceration? Why are you off to the prison? Why aren't you going over to the hospital?" And I think you don't know what all of you know, and that is that this is a bigger issue than so many of the child health issues that we've already focused a lot of attention on. And that is not to disparage any of those other issues, but it is to say that we need folks like you who are going to go out and help us tackle this issue in a meaningful way. So I think one of the things that's easy to forget about is some of the nuances of this language, and so I'm going to give a few definitions here so that I think we're all working under the same definitions and terminology today. So I think about kind of incarcerated where. We often use prison and jail interchangeably, but they make a difference, and it makes a difference particularly when we think about the impact for kids. So we can think about a county jail. This is the Washington County Jail in Stillwater, Minnesota, where we're doing some research right now. Spend many a weekend there at the county jail. Sometimes I feel like I'm on opposite work release, like I get to come in and work and then go home to sleep, and that's about it. This is a state prison. This happens to be Stillwater Prison, just down the road, actually, from Washington County Jail. And then this is Yankton Federal Prison. This matters when we think about this type of facility, because we know that there are variations in where these facilities are located. So, of course, jails are locally operated facilities, right? So if you get picked up on the weekend, you're going to go to a county jail. Likely you're close to home. Your loved ones might be able to come visit on a more regular basis, right? Or you're there for a short period of time. A state prison, right, is of course where someone goes if they commit a state offense. They break a state law in Minnesota. The visiting policies look different. The locations of the facilities look different. The ways that they interact with children and families in those settings looks different. And then, of course, federal prisons, where if you break a federal law, you're going to end up in a federal prison, and more often than not in the state in which you were arrested or convicted, right? So you could be 10 states away from your children if you commit a federal crime and are put in Danbury, right? So this is important, and we, of course, there are some nuances to this. We know that across the country and in the state of Minnesota, some of our state prisons are full, so we move offenders to county jails. This is an interesting situation because all of the county jails in Minnesota are non-contact visits. Those visits between parents and children are through plexiglass, right? So if you are in a county jail, that's what your visit looks like, through plexiglass. if you're an offender in a state facility, you can have contact, meaning that you can be face-to-face with that person. I use contact loosely here, and we'll talk about that later today about what contact really looks like. But I say that because we work with men at Stillwater right now who say, I like being up the street at Stillwater at the prison better than I like being in the Washington County Jail, because I can at least see my children face to face. So this gets a little bit tricky when we think about incarcerated where. In Minnesota, here's what we know. There are a handful of counties out of our 87 counties that don't have their own jails. But in mid-year 2012, there were over 7,000 inmates in county jails in Minnesota. Now, if we mapped on those national statistics, we could estimate that at least half of those are also parents. What we know is that in state prisons in mid-year 2013, we had over 9,000 men and over close to 700 women. And again, if we estimated the number of parents in that group, because we don't collect those data systematically, so I can't tell you with certainty how many of those inmates are also parents, which is a problem. But if we were to map on those estimates, what we know is that at least 55% of those are also parents. And then we can think about the federal prisons in Minnesota. And we happen to have 4 facilities under the Bureau of Prisons in our state. We have Duluth, Sandstone, Rochester, and Waseca, which houses women. And you can see there close to another 4,500, 5,000 inmates in our state here. Many of whom in these federal facilities, right, aren't individuals who have their families living in Minnesota. So have children and loved ones and their support people hundreds of thousands of miles away. And this makes an important difference when we think about incarcerated where. So we often will use, and we've used it here today, this idea of parental incarceration as sort of this umbrella term to talk about parental incarceration broadly, whether that be incarcerated in jail, state, or federal prison. And I think that these nuances are important to keep in mind when we think about how that impacts children and families, particularly with regard to contact. So what we know about parental incarceration is that parental incarceration is a risk factor for a whole host of negative outcomes. That includes things like depression, anxiety, and withdrawal for their kids, aggression, substance use, and delinquency, and things that cause challenges in the school environment like poor grades, truancy, and school failure. But this picture, whether we're talking about substance use or skipping school, is really not at all straightforward. And the science behind this is getting better and has gotten a lot better over the last decade, but is still a very complicated and messy picture, as you can imagine. So what we know about parental incarceration is that it's linked to a whole host of other risk factors, including poverty. So we know, for instance, that in the month before arrest, most incarcerated parents reported earning less than $2,000 a month. So for a family of 4, for instance, this would put them right at the poverty line. We also know that education is a huge, huge variable here. At the time they entered prison, half of incarcerated fathers and 40% of incarcerated mothers had not graduated from high school. And what we know from countless studies that have nothing to do with parental incarceration, right, is that educational attainment of the parents is one of the strongest predictors of educational attainment of the next generation. So you take out incarceration out of this mix, and we know that education is a really important piece, right, regardless. And so we add on to the fact that many of our parents have limited education and they're in prison, and the risk factors start to pile up. We think about residential mobility being a key issue. For some, but certainly not all, the parent was living with the minor child prior to their incarceration. This, of course, results in a separation of the child and the parent, right? And the child may be, as we heard from Deborah, moved from foster home to foster home to foster home, or maybe they're living with grandma, or maybe they're living with aunt. You'll hear a story today during the film Mothers of Bedford about 2 kids who were moved from grandma's house to aunt's house and back to grandma's house. And we know that residential mobility in these settings really does matter. We can also think about the parent's employment or employment status. We know, for example, that 1 in 5 parents, incarcerated parents, reports earning a living or at least receiving income from obtaining illegal sources, from participating in criminal activity, right? 20% of them, prior to their arrest, say, I was engaging in some sort of illegal activity that brought money into my family. Well, what happens when they're arrested then, right? That income, whether it was illegally obtained or legally obtained, right, is lost on the family. So the family then has a decrease in family resources when the parent goes to prison. This is important too when we think about what children might have been exposed to in their parents' prior to their parents' incarceration. We know that there are physical, mental, and chemical health issues that are pervasive in this population. That again, if you were to ignore the fact that some of these parents are going to end up incarcerated, we know that kids who are living with parents who have chronic mental, physical, or chemical health issues, that those kids don't fare well when their parents aren't supported, right? And so Deborah mentioned, for example, that she was able to get some support for her heroin addiction, but her mother wasn't. And we can think about what that environment, what it might have been like had she not been born in prison. And so this is an important piece of this, because prior to the arrest or incarceration, that child's living environment might be more or less chaotic depending on their parents' physical, mental, and chemical health issues. I can't emphasize the racial disparities enough. What we know is that in every phase of the criminal justice system, we see marked racial disparities. And this is something that we really should be talking about as adults. We talk about all of this issue here in this room, but this is something today that we're going to have to spend some real time in our breakout sessions talking about. Previously, I told you that it was 1 in 43 children who had a parent currently incarcerated. Among African American children, that number is 1 in 15. That's something that when I hear that statistic, it still makes my stomach hurt. 1 in 15 African American children currently has a parent in prison. This is something we really have to be paying attention to. And so when we think about this complex picture, right, we know that it's all of these things that contribute to less optimal child outcomes. The science is getting a lot better at trying to parse out some of these effects. And what we know now is when we account for some of these other variables, statistically can control for those things, what really hangs true is the effect of parental incarceration on children's antisocial behavior, above and beyond all those other risk factors. Now we know, as I told you earlier, that parental incarceration is a risk factor for things like internalizing problems, the depression, anxiety, withdrawal, externalizing problems, the antisocial behavior, delinquency, those sorts of things, and school failure, all of those things related to the school environment. But when we account for all of these other complex variables, the thing that seems to hold the strongest is that link to antisocial behavior. And again, this has long-lasting implications for potentially the next generation of offenders. And so we really the onus is on us to figure out a way to break this cycle. I've hinted at this before, but I think it's really important that we remember the complexities of the risk factors that come before, during, and after incarceration. It is not just for these children that the parent goes to prison and now their world is turned upside down. That is true, but a lot has happened prior to the incarceration of the parent, right? So before the parent's incarceration, kids might have been living in chaotic neighborhoods, or crime-ridden neighborhoods, or neighborhoods with very low social capital. They might have been exposed to their parents' drug use or criminal behavior. They might have witnessed their parents' arrest or the criminal proceedings. And these things make a difference in the impact that it has on their adjustment. During incarceration, we can think about the impact when the parent visits, or the child visits the parent, and what that exposure might be like. We can think about their separation from siblings as being another important factor. You've got the little girl up there with the moving boxes scratching her head, like where's she going next? Because we know that for some of these families, moving around is very common. And housing mobility is, of course, related to school mobility that can be really disrupting for kids. And then on that last picture there, thinking about what does that contact look like? Is there contact? Are they thousands of miles away from their parent, or are they in the county jail that's 15 miles away in a public bus ride there? These are all things that matter when we think about the trauma exposure for kids. And then after, we know that when parents are released from prison and jail, that their struggles are not over, right? That finding stable employment, staying clean, finding housing, they encounter many challenges that make that difficult for their family system. And so even if the parent has come back into the family system, and is a welcomed person back into that system, there's still a lot of restabilization that needs to happen, right? And so even if that's a good thing, that the parent is home, and which in many cases it is, it's still a challenge and can be a disruption for the child. I think it's important, and we're going to have some fabulous stories today talking about protective factors, things that we're doing in our neighborhoods and communities across Minnesota that we're doing to support children and families in a very remarkable way. We know that caregivers can be the most stable source of support and can really, really help promote children's development when a parent is in prison, whether that be grandma, whether that be Aunt Susie, whether that be a loving foster home that really wraps their arms around the child and supports them. That those can be important protective factors and help mitigate some of those complex risks that children experience. We also know that when kids are doing well in school and they feel connected to their schools, that they can thrive in that environment. And you've heard once today, and you're going to hear it again, that education has a really important component here. That if we can get kids engaged in school and help them stay connected to school, whether that be through teachers or mentors or after-school programs, that can help lessen some of these negative impacts. I'm a little biased because I'm a developmental psychologist, so I always think about this perspective with kind of my developmental psych lens on, which is I beg you to think about this issue from a children's perspective with regard to the age of the child. We know that more than half of the kids who have a parent currently in prison are under the age of 10. And for any of my parents out there, you can think about the difference between what your 3-year-old could do at 3 and what your 13-year-old knows and can do at 13, right? So your 13-year-old can say, I'm not showering, I'm not eating that, go to hell, right? I have a 13-year-old, I can talk about what 13-year-olds do. But they also have the language and the skills to talk about their wants, their wishes, their contact. 3-year-olds can't do that. 13-year-olds can say, I'm scared, I'm sad, I'm upset, I'm angry, right? 3-year-olds show their behaviors in different ways. They show their feelings in different ways. And so I think it's important that we think about all of this with regard to how old is the kid, what are their developmental capacities, and where do we meet them where they're at developmentally to really support their needs, whether that be supporting infants through prison nurseries or teen visiting programs at the prison, right, specific to meeting them where they're at for their developmental age. I'm going to close with thinking about what we've got on our agenda today. When we were planning this event and I was looking over the incredible group of people that we had coming, I just felt like, I don't want to spend 20 minutes. I want to spend all this time talking about the prison doula program or Deborah's book or this incredible film that you're going to see this afternoon. All of these things are happening around our state and our country, and I really do hope that you leave here feeling like there are people around the state who are doing incredible, powerful, and meaningful work, because as difficult as this work is, and as sometimes how struggling it can be for those of us who are doing it, I think it's important that we all connect with each other and realize that there is incredible work that is happening on behalf of children and families impacted by incarceration. And I will close there. So I have the privilege of introducing Warden Eddie Miles. Warden Miles is the warden at Lino Lakes, where he has been a strong vocal advocate for efforts to improve reintegration for those leaving prison and to reduce the cycle of re-imprisonment. Warden Miles appreciates opportunities to talk with others about the importance of prison work and believes that his advocacy work helps maintain his commitment to corrections work. And on a personal note, I do have to say that Warden Miles was the first warden I ever reached out to as a child psych instructor. I teach at the Institute of Child Development, and I emailed Warden Miles and I said, I thought this was a long shot. I said, hey, I teach this class on incarceration in the family. Any chance you would want to come and talk? I got an email back within 5 minutes, and he said, absolutely, I would love to. And I thought, we're going to be friends. So he is a phenomenal, phenomenal man, and you're in good hands. You got that one? Yep.